To deal with Tehran's threats, the world should stand with Iran's people. There's no denying that Iran's ruling theocracy is a global threat. Tehran is holding dual citizens as hostages and is using them as bargaining chips in negotiations. Its diplomats are carrying out espionage operations in foreign countries and plotting to detonate bombs, including in opposition rallies in European capitals. It is dashing toward obtaining nuclear weapons and is trying to disrupt energy markets by staging missile and drone attacks against vital oil and gas facilities in neighboring countries. Unfortunately, while the global threat of Iran's regime has evolved over the years, the West's policies towards Tehran hasn't. It has amounted to turning a blind eye to the regime's belligerence and showering it with unwarranted concessions, naively hoping that the regime would moderate its behavior and become a responsible player on the international stage. If the facts on the ground are any indication, that approach has miserably failed, further emboldening and enabling the mullahs to continue their rogue and destabilizing behavior. On May 11th, Iranian authorities arrested 2 French tourists in Tehran. The previous week, the Iranian judiciary confirmed the death sentence of Ahmad Reza Jalali, a Swedish professor jailed since 2018. Both cases are highly political and part of the regime's hostage-taking policy as a tool for foreign policy. At the same time, Tehran is inching towards obtaining enough fissile material for an atomic bomb after stalling nuclear talks in Vienna with maximalist demands. As part of a potential nuclear agreement, the regime demands the removal of its notorious Revolutionary Guards, IRGC, from the U.S. list of foreign terrorist organizations, FTO. This is the same organization that is spreading terrorism across the globe, including Europe. One notable case is that of Asadollah Assadi, an IRGC agent and career senior Iranian diplomat caught red-handed while carrying out a major bombing plot in France in 2018. We have seen repeatedly that appeasing the regime has the opposite effect, yet Western diplomats insist on continuing this failed policy. On May 11th, Enrique Mora, the Deputy Secretary General of the European External Action Service, EEAS, traveled to Tehran to meet with Iranian officials to discuss the nuclear impasse. As expected, his trip did not amount to much. Iran's regime has a long history of procrastination by giving positive vibes in meetings and backtracking on its promises later. As the saying goes, it never walks the walk. Interestingly, while Mora was in Tehran, people in many Iranian cities were protesting skyrocketing prices of basic goods. At the same time, Iranian teachers in many cities held demonstrations in protest to the arrest of teacher activists and the government's destructive economic policies. A week later, protests erupted in Abadan and several Iranian cities after the 10-story Metropole building collapsed, causing dozens of deaths and many more injuries. It is worth noting that these protests are taking place while the regime has been restricting internet access, arresting and threatening civil rights activists, and taking other repressive measures to prevent the spread of protests. In their rallies, the Iranian people are making it clear that they reject the mullah's bellicose stance towards the world. The people of Iran want housing, food and job security, on-time wages, education for their children, and most importantly, they want freedom. They do not want to squander the country's wealth on building nuclear weapons, funding terrorism, and developing ballistic missiles. The Iranian people, who overwhelmingly demand change in their country, are the world's greatest ally in dealing with the threats stemming from Tehran. And yet, Western politicians insist on meeting and dealing with those whose rule and power depend on maintaining those threats. After decades of failed attempts to engage the regime, it is time for the West to adopt a new policy that supports the people of Iran. An example was the May 16th trip by former U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to Ashraf III, Albania, home to some 3,000 members of the main Iranian opposition, the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran. In his visit, Mr. Pompeo also met with Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, the president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, NCRI. The MEK has the largest network of activists inside Iran, who have helped expose the regime's illicit nuclear activities and terrorist operations. Today, the MEK-affiliated resistant units inside Iran are playing a key role in organizing ongoing protests.
A serious missing factor in U.S. policy towards Iran has been the lack of political support for the organized opposition. The regime in Tehran went to the extreme to massacre 30,000 political prisoners whose main targets and a majority of its victims were the MEK. The threat of attack extends far beyond Iran's borders, with the regime having waged terror plots throughout Europe and the United States against the leaders of this movement. Now to correct Iran policy, no matter who is in the White House, it is a necessity for the United States administration to reach out to the Iranian resistance.
World leaders should heed Mr. Pompeo's apt advice. The explosive state of Iran's society makes it abundantly clear that this regime is living on borrowed time. Sooner or later, it will be toppled by the people of Iran and their resistance movement. It is up to world leaders to decide on which side of history they will stand.